Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Research the News. This week, we have Ben back on the show. It's second week as the new co-host. Now, typically, we're going to have episodes with guests, and we'll be focused on some long-term issues, but some of the episodes, like today, will be focused on current events, because I'm not sure if you've been watching the news lately, but there's a lot of stuff happening. So right now, we're going to talk about things like the vice presidential choices, some Supreme Court reform proposals, and maybe some other things. But to get started, let me bring on Ben Hardt. Ben, welcome back.
Right. Good to be back.
Second episode.
Yeah.
Wow.
Last one from New York for a while.
Really?
From Brooklyn, New York. So.
Oh, are you going back to Nashville?
No, I'll be to Chicago this weekend, then to Portugal, then to Spain, then to Nashville.
Man.
Then to Austin.
Starting out the second episode with a beautiful humble brag. I love it.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. So you'll see lots of different backgrounds.
Nice. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing the Portugal one.
I'm going to do like the fake news background where they pretend that they're on scene.
Or the ones where they
like
have
green screen it.
Have you seen where they have people in rowboats that are coming by in the background, and then all of a sudden you see it's actually like 1 foot of water when there's like the big hurricane? So yeah, something similar to that would be perfect. But yeah, Ben, I don't know if you've noticed, but there's a lot of stuff in the news going on. I mean, we missed the whole Trump assassination part. We missed the Biden movement. So we kind of came on a little bit too late for those things. But I did figure I want to talk to you because if you're a first-time listener, Ben and I have some different political opinions and wanted to kind of see what your thoughts are on JD Vance, the vice presidential nominee, and see who you think Kamala Harris might be picking for her VP. So what do you think? Yeah. What do you think about JD Vance to start?
So you and I were having a conversation a little bit about JD, and I come into this conversation as sort of the uninformed. I never had heard of JD Vance before Trump nominated him as his VP. And so, yeah, I missed the book he wrote and stuff like that. It's interesting. I've usually tried to stay in touch with a fair amount of, politics to big players, et cetera. But he was a guy who went under the radar for me. So, which is probably true for most of the U.S., right? Mm-hmm. I think he's one of those guys that, and that's true for a lot of VPs. No one's really heard of a lot of these folks until they get picked, unless you're from their home state or wherever they're practicing politics in a sense.
Right.
So I did a quick read when he first got nominated. I talked to my dad about it, and so my dad's also right-leaning conservative, but we'll still talk politics somewhat when we get too into it. But
yeah.
It was interesting, just, the biography of him, of where he started. He started in similar Rust Belt territory that we did and sort of became the speaker of the Appalachia, so to speak. And then I'm just going to throw you what I know of him. And
there's not many people at this point that haven't heard of him that are involved in politics at all. But I think it's interesting to hear your viewpoint of, I think probably both sides, both what you think of him based on some of the history you now know about him, and what you know of him based on everything you've heard about him since 3 weeks that he's been the vice presidential nominee.
Yeah, and I haven't researched him a ton, which is unlike me. But yeah, you're getting sort of the layman's view here of probably just the little sound bites and snippets I've heard from the media or social media, et cetera. So yeah, he comes from there. Obviously, the sound bites that he wrote a book, right, that became a bestseller. I know that he's a military veteran, which is how he got into, I think, Yale Law, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
And became, wrote the book that became he was the mouthpiece or face of the Appalachian Rust Belt. Those are sort of combined, but they are different.
Right.
As those of us who grew up in it. But other than that, it was that I knew that he was outspoken about Trump when Trump was first running and elected, has since at some point changed his tune, being against Trump and then for Trump. And then there's a couch meme that's running around, and that's about it.
Yeah, and I think
to fill
for the
out
children
the full,
listening,
yeah, exactly.
I would say that's
why I just left it at that.
Yeah, just Google JD Vance and couch. I think it's pretty interesting because
when you're 18.
I had, yes, I had actually heard of JD Vance, but the reason I had heard of JD Vance was because of all my liberal friends who told me a couple years ago, you got to read this book by this guy, JD Vance. He really gives a voice to poor white people and the poor people in Appalachia. And it's an amazing book. And honestly, I didn't read it. I just didn't really have a lot of concern for it at the time. I had it on my reading list and just didn't get around to it. But almost to a T, the more liberal my friends were, the more highly they recommended this book. And it's been pretty interesting to see the more liberal my friends are, the more highly they do not recommend the VP candidate of JD Vance. And I mean, obviously that's to be expected because, you know, he's a Republican at this point. But there are some interesting things here, and I'll just say my opinion to start out because I tend to be a little more conservative than you, Ben, and I don't really like the pick for a lot of reasons. I'm not a big fan of JD Vance from a perspective of his policies. I don't really know what they are so far, and the things he says are kind of off-putting. The whole cat lady thing, I don't even know why you would say something like that. It seems like he hated Trump and didn't like Trump and said bad things about Trump and then said, oh, in order to advance in this party, I need to be more like Trump. But he's saying things that Trump might say, but quite honestly, Trump has a better way of putting them where at least some people will laugh. And I feel like when JD Vance says them, nobody laughs because he's just awkward about how he even says the awkward things. So
yeah, it's interesting the sort of like Vivek is that way, right? He's trying to be this Trump prototype and he just, you know, he's one of one. Trump is one of one. So yeah. But that was the other thing, I think, going back to when I mentioned about talking to my dad about it, sort of just briefly reading through his bio, that sort of flipped from one to the other, one, you know, opinion to the other where he was anti-Trump and now Trump. I think to your point, I literally said to my dad, I was like, he just seems like another typical politician. He's just going to say what he needs to say to get to the position or get to the office kind of thing. So, versus somebody, for better or for worse, who's sort of sticking to their principles or, you know, the higher principles. Whereas, like, I would argue that Mike Pence, and we've had a conversation about this, was much more, I don't agree with him on most things, obviously, as someone who's more left-leaning, but I respect the heck out of him. I won't swear. But
especially in honor of Mike Pence, you know.
That's right. Yeah, he would certainly say the good old Midwestern.
Yeah,
I certainly respect his, even from reading about even before the January 6th and all that stuff. Even before, he's a principled person who part of his principles were the sort of U.S. Constitution, the legacy of the propriety of the U.S. government and what a politician should be. So on that aspect, I respected him way more. But yeah, to that point, JD Vance just seems like sort of another politician.
Yeah, 100. And I think on top of that, even the Vivek Ramaswamy, when he comes across is more Trumpian. I actually really liked Vivek before I knew much about him. When I don't know if you saw any of his early campaign speeches and events when he was running for president, he would have people, and I honestly, as someone who's skeptical, I don't know if they were plants or what, but there would be a lot of people who would show up to protest, and he would actually invite them in and talk to them, and he'd have intelligent conversations with them and treated them like people. And I said, oh, I actually like this guy. He seems intelligent, and he also is able to have conversations with people who are clearly disagreeing with him. And then after that first debate, he just got up on stage, and you could tell he wanted to either be VP for Trump or he wanted to be in his cabinet, and just attacked everyone.
Yeah.
And it was like Trump was still on stage. But again, like him or not, there are some times where Trump is pretty funny with the things he says, even if you don't want your president to be saying them. He's got a way of delivering things, whereas
he has comedic timing.
Yeah. I would say Ramaswamy is better than JD Vance, but it just means he sounds more mean. So he's better at delivering the mean lines, but it doesn't make me say, okay, that's someone I really want running the country. So yeah, I mean, I'm not a big fan of JD Vance. I think personally, I was hoping for Tim Scott. I don't know if you're familiar with Tim Scott at all, but
that was my next question. Who you thought would be a good VP pick and why? Do get 2 minutes or a minute on why Tim Scott?
So I think Tim Scott, I like his story. There was a podcast he did with, I forget the woman's name, but she was a New York Times columnist. It was about an hour-long podcast interview with him, and he seemed really down to earth. He seemed like a genuine guy. He just seems like a nice, decent human being. He clearly does have some politician-y vibes, but not as much as a lot of the other people I've seen in Congress. And so for me, it was more of, I think that he was someone who could actually potentially be a unifier. I know Biden said he was going to be, and that to me failed miserably. Trump is now saying he's going to be a unifier, and we're seeing how that's going. I think someone like Tim Scott could actually bring people together, and he wasn't that attack dog. I think someone like Ben Carson, no way would I want him to be a vice president. He seems like a very genuinely good human being, but he doesn't have kind of the political skills to be able to, even talk on a debate stage, but also bring people together. Whereas someone like Tim Scott, I feel like he is a eloquent speaker, really interesting backstory, and someone who I think actually would have the chance to kind of cool the temperature down, which a lot of people are saying that at this point, and no one's still doing it. So I do like that about him. I think Trump one time said that he would probably be the presidential nominee if he wasn't so nice. And I think there's some truth to that. And I think he would have gone further so far in politics if he was more political, backstabbing, rude. And like I said, I don't know him personally, but he just comes across as someone that I could get behind as a human being.
So both of your picks, and you didn't mention it, but I think it's worth mentioning because this is part of this world, on both sides, right, is race, right? And so both of those guys are black guys. And so, yeah, I think that, and I'm saying that because conversely, Kamala, as a woman of color, she's mixed, but mostly gets identified and identifies as black. The chess move is to pick a white guy as the VP. And so, like, yeah, that makes sense. I'm not saying that's the main reason for it, but it is to what you're saying. Maybe not, but if he dumps JD Vance, which, there's rumors he's going to dump JD now that I don't know that that'll happen. That he's got not a lot of time to do it, but this would sort of be that answer to that. Not that I'm saying that he shouldn't have picked one of them in the first place. Carson, I feel bad for Ben Carson because I feel like he just sort of got thrown into. The guy's like a brilliant surgeon. He's a brilliant neurosurgeon, right?
Yeah.
And so,
terrible public speaker, but again, seems like a great human being, brilliant guy.
Yeah, and that's who I want. Like, if I want someone working on my brain, I want the guy who isn't. If I know he's really good, I don't need him to be eloquent or like.
I don't want him to be I want him to be socially awkward, so I know he's not just faking it and he's actually good at his job.
Yeah, he's like practicing at home on a fake brain or something on his off time. Yeah, because he doesn't know how to have friends. But I'm not saying that's true about Ben Carson, but you get the idea. Whereas Tim Scott, I think, is a great pick because he is. I've also heard in general that it's better to pick a senator as a VP than. And it's going to get into, you're saying, like, who I think potentials for Kamala will be. That's part of that is, there's a lot of governors being thrown about, names being thrown about. And I think for your point, Tim Scott as a senator does. And he's South Carolina, right? He's Southern. So that helps with that as well.
It's a swing state, kind of. I think, and just to be clear, though, too, I think there's one other person that I would like more who doesn't happen to be a black guy, but I don't want him running because I don't want him tainted with Trump, because I do, from what I've seen so far, I think he actually has the potential to really bring down the politics level after we're done with this election cycle. Glenn Youngkin, are you familiar with him much, the Virginia governor?
Heard his name, but don't know much about him.
It's very rare to get a Republican senator or Republican governor in Virginia. He came along 2 years ago now, I guess it was, and seems like a decent human being. He came from a business background. People in Virginia really like him. He did a lot of things about school choice and really focused on education and reforming that. And one of the things I think is actually good about him is since the election, I haven't heard much about him. And I say that because I think that anytime people would have a chance to attack him, they would love to do that for people who are opposed to him. And they haven't really found a way to attack him. He seems to be doing a pretty good job there. And on the Republican side, I think they don't really want to taint him by involving him with Trump, because he was someone that didn't invite Trump to any of his rallies, didn't really want to be involved with him before. He did go to the RNC this year, but he's someone that I think actually does, again, he's shown that he can win in a blue state. He's brought the temperature down there. He seems reasonable. And so that would actually be a choice. Tim Scott, then Glenn Youngkin, but I wouldn't want Glenn Youngkin to be on with Trump's ticket because, I think Tim Scott could get away from that, but I don't know if Glenn Youngkin could survive the Trump ticket.
Yeah. It's such a shame. And I think this is where you and I agree that ideally the system works when you have two parties or more that are reasonable, that are bringing their, hey, well, we want to push this forward. No, let's think about this. Or we want to push this forward. No, let's think about this. I think it's a shame right now where the Republican Party has ended up because of that. I think to your point, there's more than probably the news lets on of reasonable Republicans in the mix, but unfortunately there's a few unreasonable ones that are taking all the airtime. So I would love to see that return to, the more reasoned Republican Party of the past. I as someone who doesn't usually vote Republican, but understands the value of a balance of power.
I agree. And I think that goes for both sides. I mean, if you watch Fox News, all you see are the AOCs of the world and the squad. And those are what represents the Democratic Party. And when you watch CNN, it's all of Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz. And gosh, man, Matt Gaetz. Oof. I will say, though, speaking of AOC, Ben.
Your favorite.
Last week when we were on the show, do you know where I'm going with this?
No.
Last week on the show, we talked about steel manning and straw manning, and I brought up that AOC district was probably 98% Democrat. Right. And you told me that I was being ridiculous, and I was joking about 98, but turns out it was 90.32 or something. I looked up the numbers afterwards, so it wasn't far off. But that's kind of when you look at someone like AOC, that's how someone like AOC can get elected to Congress, because that district is extremely far left, and so she is a far left candidate. She comes in and all of a sudden she's the face of the party, because on Fox News at least, because her views to me are pretty silly. And so they represent her instead of more moderate, well-spoken Democrats. And I think the same goes too. You don't see Mitt Romney on CNN much. You see Matt Gaetz, you see those kind of people, Marjorie Taylor Greene swearing at someone on the floor of Congress. And it's well, can we just talk about Mitt Romney, saying that we need to bring people together? And, it's craziness. So yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah. Similarly, she comes from a deep red part of Georgia.
Yes.
Exactly. Gaetz, that might be a more mixed, I don't know, Florida is a little bit more mixed, but that's probably a fairly Republican.
I mean, there's certain parts of Florida though, that are certain parts. You look at West Virginia, you talk about Appalachia. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Pennsylvania. I mean, there's parts where you're oh no.
The rural T.
Yes. I like it. I've never heard that before.
It's Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and then the rural T.
Yeah.
Which that could lead into the VP conversation, since there's the governor of Pennsylvania is on the short list for Kamala. Should we go that way? We can do that.
Yeah, I like it. I am from Pennsylvania.
So am I.
Yes, we both are originally. We're Pennsylvania born. And Josh Shapiro, the governor, so far, I think he's kind of like a Youngkin, where you haven't heard much about him, but the things I've seen of him, I actually think he seems like a pretty reasonable human being. But the interesting part, Ben, I don't know if you've heard this, there's some pushback because he's Jewish coming from Democrats. And so, again, it's crazy.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
Yeah, it's crazy though when you bring up any VP candidate, you're looking at race, religion, gender, all of these things instead of what have they done. So, I mean, Josh Shapiro, from what I've seen, he seems like a moderate Democrat, and he seems like he's done some decent things in Pennsylvania. Although, quick side rant, if you want to go from Pennsylvania to Philadelphia on our toll road that wasn't supposed to be a toll road anymore.
You mean Pittsburgh to Philadelphia?
What'd I say?
You said Pennsylvania to Philadelphia.
Yeah, well, I mean, Pittsburgh is Pennsylvania. I mean, we're the good part of the state. So, yes, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, it's $118. I mean, that's as much as the tolls to the rest of the country. So do something about that, Josh Shapiro, and you may have a vote. But yeah, I mean, from what I know of him, he seems like a non-exciting pick, except for the fact that he's Jewish, which will stir up some of the Democrat, more liberal, progressive voters. So what do you think of him?
I think I think that aspect of it optically, I mean, that's the thing, is a VP pick is, I mean, a great quick note here. I think a great topic would be subtopic for another time is what is the role of the VP, and traditionally what has the role been? Because the quick one is obviously second in line should something happen to the president, but also an advocate in the Senate, where they can actually go. The president is usually not allowed to go into the congressional halls, whereas their VP can. There's some rule around that, but so that's why I was saying earlier why it's actually advantageous to usually have a senator versus a governor or somebody else as your VP, because they know people in the Senate get from there.
Yeah.
And can kind of glad hand and do that thing. The Jewish thing is a hot button for either side. I think you've got extremes in
Right.
both parties that would not like to see a Jewish candidate. I think that's more recent that the far left, because of Israel-Palestine, I don't think that would have been as big of a factor a few years ago. But, the role of the VP now is more optical than anything. It's more optics than anything. And so that's where it is this sort of racial chess match in a sense.
Yes.
That's
a great way of putting it.
Man, I was thinking about that earlier today. Chess is like this hundreds of year old game, but the principles of it are still the same, of like the one in charge is moving the right person in the right place and can only move in certain places, but in order to like win there. That's politics. That's like organizational behavior in general. So as someone, who works with organizations in a business sense, but optically, Shapiro for a few reasons is not a great pick. I didn't even think, I think the Jewish one, the aspect of that sort of flashed in and out as I was thinking about him. I think the bigger thing is what we know as people as Pennsylvanians or former Pennsylvanians or whatever, but that, I think that the sort of higher up Democrats are saying, oh, hey, he's going to help us win Pennsylvania, the swing state of Pennsylvania, where you and I both know that like the two, like the royalty, Philadelphia and Pennsylvania are like pretty set already. You're not going to sway I don't think you would sway almost anybody by bringing the governor of Pennsylvania as your VP.
Agreed.
Like that's a very unresearched opinion. I don't know a better way to put it, but
it's not like Josh Shapiro has enough of a profile. Again, he's kind of a low-key governor, so it's not like he's some icon here and has done amazing things. He's a first-term governor who beat a really poor candidate. Like I forget the name of the Republican candidate, but he was bad. So we also had Dr. Oz running against John Fetterman. So it was Republicans didn't put up their best in Pennsylvania, or even Pennsylvanians in Pennsylvania. So
fair point.
Yeah, I feel like it's not someone that can rally the base. It's not like they have Barack Obama there as the governor and someone along that stature that could actually get people fired up.
Yeah. So my two other picks originally, and I'm going against my word here because they're both governors. My first pick was
Wait, can I take a
Cooper.
guess? Oh, dang
sorry.
it. I was gonna guess Cooper as one.
Yeah.
And then I was gonna guess either Whitmer or, well, I was gonna actually no, because I was gonna guess Mark Kelly from Arizona, but he's a senator, not a governor. So all right. I would have got one of two.
Yeah,
Who's your
I
others?
tipped my hand. Tipped my hand. So Cooper was number one. He's North Carolina, right?
Yeah.
A Democrat. So sort of similar to that's pretty rare to be a Democrat in a southern state like that. And the other one, even more rare, is Bashir.
Oh.
Andy Bashir of Kentucky.
Yeah.
He's Democrat governor of Kentucky, well-loved, another moderate guy, family man. But it's like, it's in the racial chess match, these are both two white guys, moderate Republicans.
Yeah.
Cooper, as far as I know, or I've heard, has since sort of said he doesn't want to.
Yeah.
Which is a shame.
Who knows, though?
Again, he's like you never know. It could be like
I don't trust any of that. Yeah.
Yeah. It'd be like, da-da. But he is another, not soft-spoken, but like moderately spoken, moderate Democrat. Same with Bashir. I think Bashir's a little bit younger. But, I think what Harris needs to do, she sort of seems as like the coastal elitist Democrat. You from the optics perspective, you also need to just anchor that with like someone who's from the South. Like I think that would make a difference. So with Cooper out, then that does put Kelly in for me, actually.
Yeah. Okay.
So those are my two picks at this point. So you were close.
All right. Well, I think let's kind of move on to some Supreme Court issues. But before we do, I think we might be on the same page for this. But do you think that Trump should dump Vance?
I don't know that it would help or hurt his chances at this point.
Yeah.
I would say that like Vance is dead weight, but I think Trump has always run this as sort of singular entity.
Yeah.
That people who are voting for Trump are voting for Trump. They don't really care who the VP is. So, I mean, if you want a personal opinion, I think Trump should do what Biden did and drop out, and we should have a different Republican candidate too. Not Vance by any means, but like, you know, some of the guys that you mentioned.
Kamala versus Vance. That's my worst nightmare. Oh my goodness. It's terrible.
The debates would be grating.
Oh, man.
I don't know. We'll see if there's any debates at all. I guess there'll be a VP debate. We'll see. There's a lot of speculation whether there will be a presidential debate. But yeah, we can move on. That was my last thought on that. Yeah. So I don't know that it makes a difference at this point.
I will say that I think he should. I don't think it's going to make a huge difference, but he really is just, I mean, I think he's worse than dead weight. He actually has the lowest approval rating of any VP since, I can't remember the last person, but that's the thing about VPs you mentioned earlier. They're usually unknown. And when you said that, I started thinking about the dustbin of history. I couldn't tell. I can name a lot of the presidential candidates who lost. I can barely name one of the vice presidential candidates that lost because those people just have no stature in history. But yeah, I do think it would probably be a good idea in trying to find someone. I think Trump at the time when he picked Vance was right after the assassination attempt, right after the debate. Biden was at his lowest, and I think he had even more arrogance than usual and decided to just phone it in with Vance, and I think it was a poor choice, and I do think he should try to get someone else in there, but we'll see. And we don't need to get into this now, but I just think that it's still a little weird to me that we did have a presidential candidate on the Democratic side, and now that VP is the presidential candidate, and no one seems to vote for it. At some point, let's circle back around to this, because I think we could take a while to talk about this, but it's still very weird to me that that's how the democracy is working.
Well, it's unprecedented for sure. I mean, it's unprecedented. It's only happened once before, and that was it Johnson, right?
Yeah, because Johnson knew he wasn't going to win re-election, and
he did it at the convention, which was even more disastrous. So, yeah, I have thoughts on it where I think it is sort of a razor's edge kind of thing, but I think it could have been a lot more egregious than it was in this way. I think it's still best for the country that Biden stepped down, you know.
I agree that it's best for the country. It's just strange that a bunch of people voted for him. He's the candidate, and I don't know.
I would say that if it was anybody else than his VP that was already his VP, that was sort of a package deal. Because in a sense, it is different, but it's no different than, let's say Biden let's say he won, and even between him winning and let's say he died between him winning and the inauguration, Harris would still be the president.
Yes.
So I think if they had done like a full switch out, it would be a different story, but she was sort of part and parcel with Biden already. And, you know, this sort of illuminated the way that both parties work in this, and that it's just like the Electoral College. It's not a true democracy. It's actually a representation. You know, it's like there are delegates, and they're the ones who vote. And of course, you know, the delegates usually vote with the voters.
And like I said, this is a whole other episode. I will just say that I think this is getting away from the fact of whether she should or shouldn't be the nominee. I think we do disagree here, and I think it's a bigger episode, but I think this goes back to probably a fundamental difference between you and I. I tend to focus more on the long-term effects and the precedent that's set from it. And I hear like I understand that if it was someone else, like naturally that would be, okay, that's a little bit more weird that we just kind of instilled someone. And yes, if he died, but those things didn't happen. And so it's one of those situations where at one point I really hoped that both Biden and Trump would drop out and we'd have some new candidates and get some kind of excitement for both parties in here. But it's not the way it works, and it's not the way it's supposed to work. And I hear you. I know these delegates are supposed to vote, but we're given the people they were supposed to vote for. And not having an open convention, that would have been disastrous for the Democrats, having people fight for the position. Mm-hmm. But that also would have been a better way of doing it. That would have been more towards what the actual plan was in place. And now it's just kind of, I remember the day after that was announced, they said that Kamala had worked really hard and secured the nomination. I was like, it's been less than 24 hours, if that's hard work. Like, right. Clearly, Barack gave you the stamp of approval. So again, a whole nother episode, but I think that's something we should dive into because I think we could really get into some debates there.
Yeah.
And speaking of debates, Ben, I'm interested because we have not talked about this yet. I think we talked a little bit in Ireland about Supreme Court.
Yeah.
But Biden came out yesterday and announced that he was going to try to put forward some potential reforms for the Supreme Court. So I'm just going to go over them real quick, the overview of what they are. Basically, this is coming from CBS News. We'll put a link up on the website. Term limits for justices. They would serve 18-year terms instead of lifetime appointments. And so a sitting president would appoint a new justice every 2 years. That's number one. Number two, there'd be an ethics code for justices. And that would mean that they have to disclose gifts, refrain from public political activities, and recuse themselves from cases with conflicts of interest. And number three, there'd be a constitutional amendment on presidential immunity. And basically that would reverse the Supreme Court ruling that grants former presidents broad immunity from prosecution. I think that is up for debate. That was coming from the CBS article, whether it's broad immunity or not. I think really what they did was kind of kick that back to a lower court. Again, I'm not a lawyer, so just from my interpretations of it and talking to some people who are in law, it isn't broad immunity, but it is something that clearly has become a talking point. So those are the three big reforms: term limits, ethics code, constitutional amendment, presidential immunity. Ben, do you agree with all of those, some of those, none of those?
So from a big picture, I'm always like, take a step back and look at it, right? It's mostly symbolic. Like, it's very unlikely that it will pass through Congress. So right. In that aspect, it's sort of more symbolic than anything else. In principle, I agree with a lot of it because I agree with, and again, there's not a lot of detail in here. It's like broad strokes versus,
yep.
But the broad strokes, I mean, they make sense to me. I think, again, to take a step back, big picture, I think it is, we come to this sort of impasse in some of these ways every so often. In some of these different, the president actually, there was different term limits that weren't in place until different parts. Like that was FDR, right? Was the term limits.
Right. Oh, FDR. We got to talk about him at some point, but yes.
Yeah, we can. Well, that's when we'll do our, who your top 3 presidents of the past kind of thing, right?
Just to be clear, before we do that episode, to people listening, just know that he is not in my top 3. It's the way you phrased it. I don't want people thinking that I love FDR because it's the closest we've come to
fair point.
A dictator. So yeah,
we could do worst three, top 3 and low. But anyway, we can talk about that another time.
Yeah.
To the matter at hand, I mean, I think term limits need to be happening for everybody. I think that's been a conversation for years for Congress people, but I think it makes sense for the Supreme Court as any other, political body, as any other, someone who's making decisions, especially with the weight that now carries, I think makes sense to have term limits. My understanding was also with that, this doesn't happen until the first one retires. There's like some procedural stuff where it's not just, hey, we're going to like, oh, hey, you've been here for 18 years, get out. I think this starts to roll after the next judge retires and continues from there. So I think that's an important point because I think there is a sort of, oh, this is politically motivated, et cetera. And in some ways, of course it is. Like, there's a reason why this came here in the first place. But long story short, I don't know that I think a lot of these things seem procedurally fair, at least on paper. So I do agree with term limits, number one. Number two, I think a code of ethics would be great. There's a lot of talk right now about a few justices, and it seems pretty obvious that they have taken, political favors or shown political favor. So, and the Supreme Court is always supposed to have been this very neutral facing, impartial. Has it ever been? No. I mean, no one's impartial, but it seems to be a little more bold-faced than it used to be with a few justices. So there's that. And then the presidential immunity one, that one's 50-50. I really respect the founding fathers, let me put it that way, and the principle that they came from, that no one is above the law, that we don't have a king. And the most one of the most amazing things in history ever done by a leader was George Washington stepping down after 8 years. That was unprecedented. And other leaders, I can't remember which one it was, said if he does that, he's the bravest man in history or something like that.
Because I think it was that
no one
had
had
ever
ever done that before.
I forget who it was, but yeah.
I think it was the French. Whoever perhaps the French king was.
Right.
Louis the so-and-so. That's me.
Yeah, Louis the 44th. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So long story short, I mean, that's what I do like about the fact that the president has only so much power. I think that's been consolidated back and forth depending on what era there is. So I think that, and Clinton had used this to try and get out of it, and so had Nixon, and so had several presidents, of like, the president has immunity. I agree with it in principle, but I think the application of it, we would have to like slice and dice. I don't know we have the time to do it today, but it could be a whole nother, its own thing, right? Where does the president have immunity? What's the role of the president?
Yeah.
Stuff like that. So,
I mean, I think I can slice and dice these pretty quick for myself. Term limits for justices, that's something I actually am 100% against for justices. I'm actually used to be 100% for it for Congress. I think there's a podcast I'm going to link to. Justin Amash, he was a Republican who switched to a Libertarian. He was the first Libertarian congressperson. He was on the Andrew Yang podcast, if you remember old Yang Gang. And he was talking about term limits. And
Yang was ahead of his time.
He was. And Justin Amash, he talked with Yang and term limits were brought up. And Amash didn't mince words. He also is someone that I see as being someone I could kind of trust in politics. And he gave a really good behind the scenes view of what happens in Congress. And he said basically in Congress, when you have Nancy Pelosi or Mitch McConnell come in, they say, all right, vote for this or else we don't give you money for your next election. And so it's basically a party line vote all the time. He didn't have nice things to say. And I thought he would be for term limits as a libertarian, but he wasn't. And he said the reason why was because people don't understand how difficult it is to actually get things done. And so that's where, to me, these reforms that we're talking about would be good to have on not just Supreme Court. I actually agree with the ethics code. I think that should be on not just justices, but also in Congress, also in presidents. I think that should be, government-wide.
No one should be able to do insider stock trading, right?
Right. Yeah. And they're finally maybe going to get over that. But Nancy Pelosi has 4 more years to become richer, I think it is, before it kicks in. So we'll see. It can follow.
She's not the richest. There's one who, oh no, she makes more money. She's not the richest. She's second richest, but she makes the most money off the stock trades. And then there's a Republican who's richer, but makes the second most money off stock trades. I gotta look that
Either
up.
way, none of these people should be trading based on, you talk about insider trading. But let me go back to my point with the term limits for justices and why I'm so against them. The whole point of this, if you guys want to do some reading, there are these things called the Federalist Papers, which Ben talked about the founding fathers. And when the Constitution was written primarily by one of my favorite people, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton also had a big part in that. And of course, he's more famous now because of the Hamilton musical. But there were some letters that were written to newspapers around the country, and they were Federalists versus Anti-Federalists. And I'm not going to dig into that too deeply right now, but Federalist number 78 is Alexander Hamilton's description of why he thinks there should be no term limits on Supreme Court justices. And basically what it comes down to is if you have a life tenure, that should help not having judges influenced by politics. And I hear what you're saying, and I understand if you're getting money and getting favors, that is something that's influencing, and that's why you can put in a code of ethics. But if you are up for re-election, I mean, look at now. I agree with you. I don't think these reforms are going to get passed, but it's going to be a big talking point for the next 2 months, 3 months. And then afterwards, we may never hear about it again. But right now, we're demonizing the Supreme Court or backing up the Supreme Court no matter what, based on your political affiliation, to say, hey, we need to either save the democracy or they're going to tear it down, but there's nothing that's going to happen from it. But I think if you take that kind of policy with judges, then they may not make decisions based on what they believe is best. And whether I think that's the one branch of government right now I still have faith in. And I was talking to a friend of mine this week who's a lawyer, and I told her, I said, I just try to recuse myself from Supreme Court decisions because I think I do more research than general public, but we have all these people that come out and say, they totally misinterpreted this wrong. And it's like, okay, I'm sure you didn't sit in on the 15 hours of debates they had orally at the Supreme Court, and you didn't look through all the case law and the history. And so it's one of those things where I'm just like, all right, you know what? I think that these people, you may not agree with Sonia Sotomayor, you may not agree with Clarence Thomas and what they actually believe the law is. But to me, it comes down to more of a difference in interpretation of the law versus a political motivation. So that's my view. Mm-hmm. All right. I said I was going to make this quick, so I'm going to move on. But that I am 100% against term limits on the Supreme Court, because I do think right now they actually probably have the least amount of power of any of the branches of government, and it should be separate but equal. Co-equal, not separate but equal. That's a wrong phrasing of the words. But so I think that going back to your point for the presidential amendment, I do think the president has way too much power at this point. I don't think this bill will do anything to solve that problem. But I think over time, power has been taken from places like the Supreme Court and places like Congress and given to the president. And now we have one person that has too much control over the government. So I'd be okay with reforms that bring some of these executive orders away from them. Some of these things that they're just fiats that then get changed by the next president and they're not actually voted on. So I'd be okay with that. I don't really care about this constitutional amendment on presidential immunity because I think it's just a talking point. And I think that's it. That's my quick thoughts that turn longer than I thought they would be.
Yeah. So it brought up a few points for me in that actually it was funny, sort of maybe steelmanned my thoughts of why we do need term limits. So a lot of the reason that the president has consolidated power is because Congress has been so ineffective.
Yes.
Right. It's like we've had one of the most ineffective Congresses in the past probably 16 years, maybe. Yeah, about that. I think the last time that Congress was super effective was probably, I would say, under the Clinton administration. I mean, that was a lot of the reason why a lot of stuff got done was because of there was this interplay that worked really well between Congress and the president. And
which, by the way, just to be clear for listeners, that was a split Congress. So it was Republicans in Congress and Clinton as a Democrat. So that's also, that's props to both the Republicans in Congress and Clinton as a Democratic president.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the last time that there was sort of the reach across the aisle.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that was where government worked. The last time that government worked really well, and it did work really well. There was a lot of reforms happen. There were a few things, obviously, some deregulation stuff that I didn't agree with, that it was part of what led to the financial crisis later on, but there were a lot of other reforms that were really good. So I think that like the fact that we have people like Nancy Pelosi, who is in her 80s, or several on both sides that have been their career politicians, that's where I see, like, would you be able to have the same amount of sway or build up the same amount of insider information to do insider trading if you had that long to be in Congress? Yeah. If you're churning through more often, and it doesn't, I mean, I think maybe 8 years and you're done, same as the president, but there's more, you have to prove yourself in those 8 years more than like, I'm just going to sit around and be a professional congressperson. And so I would say that's my argument why there should be term limits. And a side effect of that has been the consolidation of power to the president, which we both agree is not a good thing. And I would say also why I like it's a longer term for the Supreme Court, that you get 18 years. So you're not, kind of handheld by what you were saying, but it's not too long. There is some amount of movement, but, or it's that versus like an upper age limit,
Yeah.
But I would say the term limit is maybe the more fair way to put it.
Yeah. And I'll say again, as someone who was a proponent for term limits for a very long time, I hear you. I'm open to it. Yep. It's not that I'm 100% against that for Congress. For the Supreme Court, I still am. Mm-hmm. But I think one of those things with Congress is one of the things that scares me. So always, as you know, there's no solutions, only compromises, is that if you have congressmen now that only have 4 years or 8 years, it's kind of like what happens when they're getting ready to go out and they don't have any kind of limits on like, oh, I do want to get reelected. So, I mean, the idea of spending that scares me, how much money they could actually spend on their way out, since they know they don't have to worry about reelection. And by the same token, I guess since they won't be trying to get reelected anymore, maybe they'll spend less. So I don't know how that actually plays out in practice, but so many people just throw money at a problem without any real solutions in order to get reelected. So maybe it does help. So I think that's something that we can talk about that more in the future. But so I think let's recap here. Term limits for justices, you're on board. I'm not. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Ethics code for justices, I think I'm on board for that, and Congress and president.
We both are.
Okay, good there.
Yeah, we both agree.
And the constitutional amendment, I think we both think are pretty pointless.
Yeah, it would be nice. That's something to dig into more. Let's put it, I think like let's asterisk that one, because we both agree that we don't want the president to have too much power. On the other side, is there something like that would prevent the president from doing something that they needed to do in the course of their office?
True. And I think that's the part where I did not like the broad immunity of a president can do anything. I don't think that's actually what was being argued in the Supreme Court, but that was what was presented in the media, that Trump could do anything, and not just Trump, but any future president. I don't like that idea, but the idea of a president in their duties, it goes back. I mean, a good point that I heard at one time was Obama bombing that American citizen in Yemen. That was something, there was no warrant for that person. There was no congressional justification. He chose to have a drone strike and kill an American citizen. If there was no immunity, that's something that could be prosecuted. I don't think it should be. Actually, I would probably want to dig into that more before I say that as a final statement, but that's one example. Bush, with all the stuff that happened in Afghanistan and Iraq, could he be tried? I mean, we can go back, every president, Vietnam, every single president has something we could look back and go, I'm not sure about that. So having specific limits on what could be immunity, I think is worth a discussion. But just, again, this just seems like a talking point. I think the president does have too much power, but this isn't the way. So we actually kind of lined up there. I think other than the Supreme Court justice limit, I think that was pretty good.
Yeah, it's been fun talking.
Yeah, I think we should end on a high note here.
We'll do it again soon.
Yeah. So we're going to wrap up here this week, and we will be coming back again with a new episode soon. We thank you for listening. Make sure you check out our social media. There's a lot of different links that we have: Twitter, Instagram, all of that stuff, YouTube, all Research the News. And also check out the recaps on researchthenews.com. So thanks again, Ben. Look forward to coming back for a new episode with y'all soon.